with that amazing introduction. Good evening, Rotarians and guests. My name is Sana Malik and I'm your MC for tonight's meeting of Rotary Melbourne. We would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and also pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to all Indigenous Australians present with us today. Please note that most of your microphones are muted for the duration of the presentation. Accolades, comments and questions can be posted via the Zoom chat function throughout the presentation. So it is with my great pleasure to welcome you to our 15th meeting of the Rotary year and our monthly evening meeting. We're so pleased you could all make it. What a treat under this enforced lockdown to welcome our guest speaker, James Hattam. He's the CEO of Tasmanian Land Conservancy and he's waiting online and will be speaking on investing in protecting environmentally sensitive land. James will be more fully introduced shortly by our chair of the day, Claire Gregg. In the meantime, please make them both welcome. Just a reminder, our club evening meetings this year will be, oh, sorry, my screen's just gone a little funny. Just one sec. Just a reminder, sorry guys, our club evening meetings this year will be led by a team of members. We plan to have an evening meeting every second Wednesday of the month and hopefully soon all of our meetings will be in a hybrid presentation. We welcome suggestions of suitable guest members or speakers for the program. A message we are hearing more and more about is recycling and protecting the environment. I now call on Catherine Baxter with a request to Rotarians and partners for a volunteering opportunity.
Thanks so much, Sana, and good evening, everyone. We've recently become involved with Ryman, which is Rotary Inner Melbourne Emergency Relief Network. And Ryman are running a large warehouse and providing household goods, including beds, couches, tables, chairs, some electrical equipment to people that are typically long-term homeless, escaping domestic violence, coming out of jail and other situations of need, and are looking for our help. So we joined Ryman around about 6 weeks ago as a Rotary club, and there's about 13 clubs supporting Ryman, and they're looking for us to provide some volunteers. What the volunteer workforce would be doing is, as you can see in some of the photos, sorting different goods, helping to stock take goods in the warehouse, if interested, involving and being involved in goods collection. So if anyone's interested in that as well, and supporting that, but a lot more in the warehouse more than anything. The times to volunteer that are available are Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays, 2 time slots, 10 till 1 and 1 till 4, and every second Saturday, either 10 to 1 or 1 to 4. Any commitment is welcomed, whether it be once every 2 months, spending a 3-hour slot supporting Ryman. They're doing a terrific amount of work. They've only been going since July, and I would really recommend it. It's a great opportunity for us as a club to even have several members to attend and volunteer, and it provides a great opportunity for fellowship as well. So we might actually be able to see each other face to face. The good thing is in supporting Ryman as well, it is essential work. So a essential workers permit can be supplied to allow you to travel and perform this work. And it's supporting a terrific charity. Joe's going to drop out an email to everyone tomorrow, which has got a bit more detail around this and who to contact. But please, if you're interested, reach out to me. My email address is in our club annual booklet, and very interested to hear from you about getting involved. If you can't attend and support there's work from home options as well. So I can certainly talk to people about that as well. But really looking for support. It's a great opportunity, and I know I've been looking for a chance to be able to get more hands-on again because of lockdown. So I'd encourage anyone who wants to join me, please let me know and we can talk about those volunteering options. Thanks so much, Sana.
Thank you, Catherine. And I actually follow your Facebook page too, and it's very active in there. So it's a great little community if you want to jump online and check them out. So I hope we can support your call to arms. And now I'll pass the meeting to Chair of the Day, Claire Gregg, to introduce our guest speaker.
Thanks, Sana. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker for this evening, James Hattam. James has a great passion for nature and connecting people to the natural world through shared experiences, storytelling, and community involvement. He's a conservation ecologist with over 15 years' experience working in the conservation sector with government and not-for-profit organisations. His experience includes the implementation and application of conservation covenants and other agreements, philanthropic programs, marketing, communications, community engagement, and not-for-profit governance. James is a board member of the quarterly journal Island Magazine, one of Australia's leading literary magazines. He's also a member of the International Steering Committee for Coalition Wild, a not-for-profit organisation based in the US that galvanizes, connects, and equips the world's young change makers to tackle our planet's greatest conservation and sustainability challenges. In addition, James is a member of the World Commission on Protected Areas. In that role, he's an active contributor to the Young Professionals Network, which brings together professionals associated with protected areas and conservation from around the world. So clearly, James is a very busy man, and we're very fortunate to have him with us tonight. So there will be time for questions after James's presentation, so please post any questions you have in the chat as we go along. James, thank you for joining us, and we extend our warmest welcome. Over to you.
Thanks, Claire. That exhausted me listening to get that very kind introduction. I'll just share my screen, so bear with me a moment and I'll make sure that I click on all the right things. How's that? Can everyone see that? Yep, cool. So yeah, thank you. Today I'll be speaking about the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, an organisation that I've worked for the past 10 years. But just to start a little bit more about me, I won't talk about myself, but I am actually not a Tasmanian. I come from Victoria originally. I grew up down the road in Geelong and studied in Melbourne and worked all over Victoria before moving to Tassie 10 years ago, and also grew up in a Rotary family. So my parents are very active Rotarians down in Geelong, but also we grew up in Fiji where we were very much part of that Rotary community. And yeah, I guess I'm very proud to have done that, and very proud of my parents and the contribution they've made over many decades to Rotary and different communities where we've lived. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Reg, who listened to my talk, recent Rotary talk, and invited me to talk again. You might regret that, because I often get told that I can talk underwater with a mouthful of marbles about the TLC. So I'm very passionate about the work of the TLC, and very lucky that it's an organisation that very much aligns to my values and the way that I see conservation as a really powerful tool that brings people together instead of dividing people. So the TLC is a not-for-profit. It's an apolitical, science and community-based organisation. We're part of the Commonwealth's Register of Environmental Organisation and a registered charity under the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission. I'll also play a series of clips through, so you're not seeing too much, hearing too much of me, and seeing a little bit more about the incredible places that I get to work. So I'll start with a little introductory clip about the organisation.
Tasmania is home to so many unique plants and animals which are found nowhere else in the world. Tasmania is well known for its iconic national parks, but many of these species are still under threat of disappearing forever. These plants and animals rely on the critical habitat that only occurs on private land for their survival. The Tasmanian Land Conservancy was established in 2001 with $50 in the bank and a handful of committed volunteers. Since then, we have grown to be one of Tasmania's largest private landholders. Our mission is to look after Tasmania's unique natural places, rare ecosystems and habitat for threatened plants and animals on private land. From remote mountains to pristine coasts, our network of reserves protect some of the most important natural areas in Tasmania. They conserve critical habitat for our rare and threatened species and serve as safe havens for the future. We pride ourselves on looking after nature through our long-term ecological monitoring program, which captures data that is key to understanding these complex environments. This evidence allows us to assess, prioritise and implement management where it is most needed. Involving people is fundamental to our efforts to protect nature. We work alongside committed landholders to identify, protect and manage important areas on their own properties. We welcome all people to explore their connection to nature by volunteering, attending our events and visiting our reserves. We continue to seek new ways to achieve conservation that values nature and the economic, cultural and social benefits it provides us all. Join the growing community and help to protect nature for generations to come.
So you can see why I feel pretty lucky to work for an organisation that gets to work in amazing places and protect incredible landscapes like you've seen some of them there. So as the clip said, TLC works in 4 strategic ways. So by protecting nature, by protecting the highest priority areas for nature conservation in Tasmania, looking after nature by demonstrating excellence in our reserve management, innovating for nature by fostering a culture of inquiry, science, research and curiosity, and involving people by providing opportunities for them to achieve nature conservation themselves. So protecting nature, which is sort of, the most exciting aspect of what we do and sort of fundamental of where the organisation started 20 years ago. So TLC itself owns and manages around 30,000 hectares of land. So that's in our permanent reserves, which we have 23 of, which is pushing close to 16,000 hectares of land now around the state. And we also have another category of properties which we call our new leaf estate, and that's another 14,000 hectares. So we own and manage those areas, but we also work with other landholders to help them protect and manage their land for conservation. So that's another 60,000 hectares. So over 20 years of the organisation has helped protect over 90,000 hectares of land, which is a phenomenal contribution to conservation in Tasmania. So as I said, our reserves are really like the jewels in the crown of the work that we do, but we also operate other programs like our revolving fund. This is where we buy land, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's almost like conservation real estate. So we buy land, protect it, and then on-sell that land and use those funds to continue to purchase and protect more land. As Claire mentioned, conservation covenants is where I came from. I'm an ecologist by training and worked in Victoria establishing conservation covenants as well. But in Tasmania, worked with the state government here in partnership with TLC to establish conservation covenants on properties around the state. We also work with landholders to establish stewardship agreements. So these are slightly different. They're like a contract, a financial contract. They're not legally binding on the title of the property like a covenant. But we essentially pay or incentivise landholders to protect nature on their property. And we're also very proud to be the custodians of the Land for Wildlife program in Tasmania, which actually began in Victoria and is the longest running private land conservation initiative in Australia's history. It's been going for over 50 years now, I think 50 years or between 40 and 50 years. And you would see those signs all over the places you go around Australia now, those triangular green signs, which is a voluntary commitment that landholders are making to look after their land for wildlife and conservation generally. So that gives you a little sense of some of the areas that we work. So we often talk about our conservation toolkit. We're very lucky as an organisation, we're not a one-trick pony. We operate a whole bunch of different tools, and we try to apply them in landscapes where they're best fitted and best suited. So that might be in terms of the environmental or ecological characteristics of that landscape, but it might also be the social construct or the economic construct of those landscapes too, whether they're agricultural, lifestyle properties, or on an urban fringe. So you can sort of see some patterns in that map of Tasmania, where you can sort of see there is some patterns around some of the programs that we've offered in different places, and we're trying to tailor those programs to make sure that we're reflecting the communities that we're working in. As I said, working with landholders is one of the key aspects of the organisation. That's where we've helped protect over 60,000 hectares of land. And something that's very close to my heart, and where I came from in Victoria was working with landholders in northeast Victoria and then down in the southwest. And a real joy as an ecologist and as someone that's passionate about nature to work with people, particularly farmers that have a really deep connection to their land and a really strong understanding of it. And this is a photo I like to show because I'm sure some of you, when you could travel, that came to Tassie might have stopped at this view. This is at Devil's Corner, looking out over the Freycinet Peninsula with Malting Lagoon on the right-hand side there, and the incredible Hazards Granite Range of the Freycinet National Park in the distance. An incredibly iconic it's one of Australia's most iconic landscapes and an incredible national park, Tasmania's first national park, Freycinet National Park. But in that landscape, there is over 40 private landholders managing their properties for conservation. There's 2 TLC reserves and 2 Bush Heritage Australia reserves in that landscape as well. So it shows you that it's actually not just the national parks that are contributing to the protection of the landscapes that are so special to us. It's all those landholders that are committed, whether it be through a conservation covenant, whether it be through our revolving fund, or whether it be through the Land for Wildlife program, that are all different, coming from different backgrounds with different objectives, but they're all valuing nature on their property and protecting a place that means so much to all of us. The Midlands Conservation Fund I just wanted to mention because this is again a bit different, and I should have mentioned at the start. So the TLC, we are a charity, we have a big philanthropic base which we're very grateful for, but when we're developing projects we try to look at the business principles of the approach we're applying. So every program that we do roll out, we develop a really strong strategic business plan and financial case to ensure that we can fund these programs through time. So it's a critical element of what we do. So as an organisation, in the early days, we were very much reliant on government funding. Now our government funding is less than 5% of our total revenue base. And to be honest, I'm incredibly grateful for that because we can move in the ways that we want to and achieve our strategic outcomes without being tied to government funding and restricting around the things that we need to do. So business principles and strong financial acumen is a core part of the way the organisation operates, and something that I'm very grateful for past boards and CEOs and managers of the organisation. So the Midlands Conservation Fund is an innovative program in the sense that this is 2 registered environmental organisation, Bush Heritage Australia and the TLC, forming an alliance and a partnership. And the Midlands Conservation Fund is a company limited by guarantee, established in 2012, and it's an endowment fund where we use the interests and the returns made from that fund to pay landholders for conservation outcomes. And we're paying landholders in a commercial way, in a commercial landscape. All of these properties where these agreements sit are in commercial farms, large-scale commercial farms, many of which have been multi-generational, some going back to the first land grants in Tasmania. And conservation is a very different approach in these landscapes, where we try to apply, a conservation covenant, which you might term as locking something up. This doesn't work in that landscape. So it's much more of the partnership approach. So there's Bush Heritage's Matt Appleby, who's their ecologist, alongside Sam Nicholson, the farmer, and they're looking at ways that they can manage that area from a conservation and a commercial benefit. So we have 14 agreements across the Midlands of Tasmania, protecting some of the most ecologically endangered grasslands, not just in Tasmania, not just in Australia, but actually globally. Temperate grasslands are some of the most depleted ecosystems anywhere in the world, because this is where agriculture has focused. This is the most productive landscapes, and these are the places we went to when Europeans first came to Australia. So we're investing about $400,000 annually into 12 farmers across 14 agreement areas, and we're helping manage 7,500 hectares of some of our most rare and threatened ecosystems, and something that I'm really proud of and really get a kick out of working with those farmers as well. There's also a very strong commercial element to this program and to these farmers and the way that they work. So I wanted to show this little clip of Simon Cameron, who is one of the farmers in the program, and he manages an incredible property called Kingston. It's one of the most impressive properties I've ever been to in my whole career. And he's got a really great partnership with clothing brand MJ Bale. And I'll play this little clip about Simon and his property.
It's the stillness of the early mornings. It's the wildness of the early evenings. It's the variety of plants that we have here. It's the wildlife that we have here. There's a whole bunch of things make up its soul. Kingston is unique in terms of what's left with this type of land in Tasmania. We try to marry superfine wool production with benchmark excellence in land management.
If you're using your environment to manage your sheep and you've got a sheep that suits your environment, you're putting less chemical onto the environment and your sheep, and that's pretty important.
We love a challenge at MJ Bale to produce wool and turn it into a cloth from a single farm. That's special, especially when you share values with like-minded people like Simon and Lyndall here at Kingston. The reason we work with Kingston and the wool here produced in Tasmania is really simple. It's the best in the world.
You've only got to touch these wools. They're so soft, so even when it's made into a fabric, it's going to be exactly the same. These little tiny crimps have very fine, high curve on them, and that just makes them so spinnable. That's what makes good fabric.
In terms of values, it all comes down to authenticity and integrity, and what we get out of that is a noble fibre. We believe in the people and how they farm. It shows in the way that the animals are cared for, and it shows in the quality and fineness and beauty of the wool that they produce.
Kingston is a place that just gets into your blood, and it is uniquely different to any other place. And knowing what you can produce on this place is even more special.
I was lucky enough to be there when MJ Bale were filming the last aspect of that clip, and it was those three fellows walking through the flock of sheep on a really misty morning at Kingston. And the amazing thing is that the suits that those fellows were wearing were from that flock that they were walking through. And I'll never forget looking at Simon, and he had a tear in his eye, and it was this great. You could see so much of the love and care that he put into his farming and how much that property means to him and his family, and to be working with him in a conservation perspective and seeing that commercial benefit. It's a real privilege and thrill to be a part of. Another one of those slightly different mechanisms of conservation that the TLC operates is the revolving fund. So there's 4 of these funds scattered around Australia. Again, from an organisational perspective, most private land organisations like TLC operate state by state because we operate under state jurisdiction, or state legislation is the legislation that we operate on to perform protections of private property. So there's a revolving fund in South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. I actually think the South Australian one is now finished and no longer functioning, but the other 3 and the Tasmanian one is going really well. So this is where we identify properties. So we got seeded money about 12 years ago from the federal government. We got $5.5 million. And we went out and bought a whole bunch of properties, put conservation covenants on them, and then tried to find conservation-minded people to purchase them. Once we then got the money back into the fund, we did it again. We've now protected over 7,500 hectares of land, and I think sold about 43 titles of land through that fund. In the early days, we were conservationists trying to operate as real estate agents. We weren't very good and we often lost money on properties. Now we're much more savvy in the properties that we purchase, and we apply both our ecological lens but also the saleability lens. And so we have expertise on our board and in our subcommittees of our board to help guide us in the properties that we're buying, to sort of bring that commercial real estate skill set or expertise to the properties we're buying and then how we're marketing them. For those of you that have ever heard of TLC, you might on a Friday afternoon get bored and go onto our website and click on the properties for sale and dream. Lots of people do that, and there's some amazing properties there. Unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have as many properties because the market in Tasmania has gone ballistic. But the program is really, really strong, and we're actually seeing a strong link now to our bequest program where people are bequeathing properties into this program as well. So this is a little example of what those properties look like. So this was a property that TLC currently owns, Watch House Hills on the east coast of Tasmania. And what we do is we identify a property where we can use the titles that are there to get the best conservation outcome, but also to get the best commercial outcome. So you can see there's 4 lots. Those 4 titles were arranged in slightly different ways. So we did a form of subdivision where we created lots that created good areas for protection, but also good areas for house sites with views and close and accessible, things like that you're thinking about when you're building and buying a property to have a house on or to have a shack on or something like that. So you can see each lot there, the white are the areas where the people can build a house in the future. Here are a few of our reserves. So to jump from our revolving fund to our reserves, I thought I'd give you a little quick snapshot of Tasmania. This was one of our first reserves. This is Long Point Reserve at Freycinet. So the photo that I showed before is up to the left, looking back at this. But this was purchased again from a farmer, the Cotton family, that ran these areas as sheep farms. And it's one of our largest reserves. It's 500 hectares, a part of the Ramsar listed Malting Lagoon. It's also the largest contiguous patch of salt marsh, which is a nationally endangered vegetation community or habitat type in Tasmania. Research Bay, some of you may have heard about this. This was is an amazing place, and a really special thing for TLC to be a part of, and was protected, some of you might recall, back through Bob Brown being very active, but also Dick Smith donating the money to protect that property a number of years ago. This is Egg Islands in the Huon Valley, really special place. The Vale of Belvoir near Cradle Mountain, Gordon Vale in the middle of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. This is the Big Punch Bowl Reserve, also on the east coast, a beautiful freshwater wetland. Daisy Dell Rainforest up near Cradle Mountain as well. Skullbone Plains, smack bang in the middle of Tasmania, adjoining the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. This is Little Swamport Reserve on the east coast with Maria Island off in the distance. Tall Trees Reserve adjoining Mount Field National Park in the Derwent Valley. And this is one of our most recent reserves. This is Tinderbox Hills Reserve, just on the outskirts of Hobart, literally 10 or 15 minutes from the middle of Hobart, protecting some of our most rare and threatened species as well, looking back at Mount Wellington there. So this gives you a little sense. I've talked a little bit about the different programs we operate, but from a conceptual model perspective, I just wanted to show this because it sort of shows you, zoomed in at a statewide level, we identify areas of highest conservation need. And then as we zoom in, you can sort of see how in a landscape approach, we try to identify properties and then link the right conservation program or tool to those properties. So if we look at any one thing in isolation, it doesn't look like it's making a big contribution, but once you put them all together, collectively, they're playing a really important role to protecting species and allowing the free movement of wildlife, especially that relies on broader landscape values and habitat across the landscape. Looking after nature. So this is the critical element to make sure that we're looking after and managing these areas for conservation, not just locking it up and walking away. So TLC uses a science-based approach, and this diagram here is the Open Standards, which is an internationally recognised best practice approach to managing areas for conservation. I won't go into too much detail about it, but it basically allows us to prioritise, plan, implement our management, monitor our management, and then evolve through time. So we set up conservation targets across our reserves, and we develop individual reserve management plans to guide the work that we're doing. We also make sure that we can see what's occurring on these properties. So our long-term ecological monitoring program is really important to that. So we employ a science program, which we have 5 staff in, and they go out and monitor the plants and animals of these areas to make sure that they're in good condition, and whether we need to apply different forms of management, whether that be weed control, revegetation, or fire, putting fire back in the landscape. As I said previously, a key element to this is ensuring we can pay for it in the long term. So the TLC Foundation was established in 2009, also an endowment fund like the MCF. And these funds are invested, and we use the interest and returns from them to fund our effective conservation management across our reserves. So this gives you a little sense of some of the things that the guys are out there doing. So you can see our burning program there on the left. Also our monitoring program, where we use remote sensing cameras to get a sense of what animals are moving through the landscape. And also we couldn't do it without our volunteers. So there's some volunteers doing some weeding there on one of our reserves up in the north of Tasmania. The foundation is a really interesting and another great aspect pillar of the organisation. It currently sits at $18 million, which is a phenomenal effort to get it to that point. And it's funding 75% of the perpetual management costs of our reserves. So when we're raising money for a reserve, we don't just raise money for the purchase price, we actually raise money for the total endowment that we need to put into our foundation. So if we need to, we need $50,000 a year to manage an area and do the science on that area, we extrapolate that based on how much we need to earn $50,000 from the capital required. So again, this is very much guided by our board, and we have great skill-based board with investment expertise and financial acumen, and we have a subcommittee that guides the investments of that endowment. So that's managed by JB Ware, our investment managers, and we see really good returns and long-term planning to make sure that we can continue to fund our science and reserve management program. Philanthropy is another really key aspect to the TLC Foundation. So I wanted to quickly show you just these, and I'm happy to share my slides, but we have over 50 named funds. So people can establish a named fund within the foundation, and it's a way that people can, I guess, contribute and sort of pay honour to someone or contribute some sort of personal or family connection to the TLC. So almost like their own little mini foundation. So with a gift of $10,000 or more, people can set up their own named fund. We have over 50 of them now. And we invite people to tell their story. And they're really powerful ways that you can see the deep connection that people have to nature and Tasmania and contributing to a legacy of conservation. This clip, and I can't remember exactly what clip this is. Oh, this is the call clip. So this coming back to some of our work. So we do science, but we also do management. And this is a really exciting partnership that we've been doing with WWF, where we're looking at trialling, reintroducing eastern quolls, which are extinct on mainland Australia, but we're starting to see declines of them in Tasmania. And we're starting to see how we can use our monitoring and our reserves to actually build up populations of eastern quolls.
This is a pilot project here at our Silver Plains property in the Central Highlands, looking at whether we can use captive bred eastern quolls to supplement wild populations. Eastern quolls have undergone quite a large decline in Tasmania. There was about a 50% decline up until 2009. That's slowed, but it's still not really necessarily signs of recovery in many regions. So in some cases, in some senses, this is a bit of an early project. You know, typically these kinds of interventions happen when species are really at the critically endangered stage and there's not very many of them left. There's still eastern quolls in good numbers in certain areas of Tasmania, but what we're trying to do is learn about how to manage them before they get to that critical stage while we've still got plenty of them left. So we're looking at releasing a certain number of captive bred eastern quolls, looking at can they survive in the wild, do they breed in the wild. We're particularly interested in looking at what the impact is on the wild population. So are they interbreeding? Are they kind of swamping the local genetics of the wild population, or are they mingling and just promoting diversity? And we're also, what we're really keen to look at is whether they actually manage to kind of bump up the numbers of the local population, or whether they just kind of are absorbed into it and don't make much of a difference. So that's our main aims. We're also really interested in breeding activity. So this morning, for example, we caught our first of the captive bred wild females that we released with 5 pouch young, which is really exciting because not only has she survived this long, but she's successfully bred. She's got 5 babies in the pouch. I'm really hopeful about the project. It's still obviously early days, but we've got a benchmark in that there was a captive bred release at Rotary National Park as part of the attempt to try and reintroduce eastern quolls to the wild in mainland Australia. And as an example, they also released 20 animals, the same as us, but they had 16 of them die within 3 months. As of December, we still had 15 that we caught live, so we knew 15 out of 20, and we only know of 2 deaths. So survival-wise, it's looking really good, which you'd expect. We don't have foxes. We've picked quite a safe release site away from busy roads, but it's really encouraging that captive bred animals can survive in the wild. We're only on day 2 of this current trip, but we've already caught 5 of our captive bred animals, and as I said, there was 1 female with pouch young already, so that's a really encouraging sign that they can survive, they can breed. Let's see what happens from here.
Another really exciting aspect of our work is our innovation piece. So always looking for different ways or new ways to do things, or to broaden awareness around the conservation work that the organisation does. A key program is our New Leaf Carbon project. So I mentioned before, TLC owns about 14,000 hectares of other land. These areas were previously owned by guns. They were forestry properties. You can see a photo of the forests in the top right there. We developed a carbon project over those areas, and we're currently trading carbon credits on the international, it was set up on the international market, but trading in the Australian market. So when you can fly again, I encourage you all, if you fly with Virgin Australia, please tick the box. Please trust that you tick the box, because actually ticking the box there is helping protect forests in Tasmania. And we've traded carbon to Virgin over the past 7 years. And it provides a return of about $250,000 a year to the organisation, and it's proving that we can actually generate returns from conservation areas. Another aspect of a really exciting thing is our art and nature collaboration. So people connect with nature in many different ways. So we've done 2 art and nature collaborations to broaden our awareness and to reach new audience of conservation, and it's a really exciting and rewarding way to connect creatives out on our reserves. And they can often tell really amazing stories that inspire people to contribute to conservation. And I'll keep moving through before I run out of time. But involving people, a lot of people ask me, what's the reason TLC has been so successful over 20 years? And for me, it's the people aspect. And it's a bit like Matt said in the MJ Bales clip, it's around authenticity and connection. And it's a really special thing for TLC and the community that it welcomes in, and the community that's continuing to grow. So whether that be through our volunteering program, so people contributing their own skills and knowledge, but also just visiting our reserves and attending our events and just spreading the word of conservation. It's a very positive message, and it's a very inclusive message too, because it's actually about everyone, in my mind, everyone does have a deep connection to nature, whatever your background, whatever your occupation. And I think the world will be a better place if we actually focus on the things that unite us, as opposed to the things that divide us. And I wanted to finish off with an interesting aspect. These are our natural guardians, which are our supporters that are leaving a gift in their will to the organisation. And if you come along to these events, you might get a piggyback from me there in the left across the stream. But it's something that I wanted to just mention, because it's often very rarely talked about, is gifts in wills. But actually in our sector, it's a growing, and it sounds a bit morbid to talk about bequests and death in a conservation sense and in a positive sense. But it's actually a really powerful way that people are making a contribution and leaving a legacy, lasting legacy to conservation. And it's a really awesome group of people. And we just had an event on the weekend where we took our bequest supporters up to one of our reserves, and it's a great way that we can connect as a community and unite. Myself, I'm a bequester to the TLC, and it's just a great way that people can make a contribution if they can't afford it in their lifetime, but also make something that's bigger than the individual. So I'll play my last clip, which is an incredible story of Bruce and Anne McGregor, and Bruce's father, parents David and Jean McGregor, left a gift in their will to establish a conservation reserve, and TLC was lucky enough to work with the family to establish the Prosser River Reserve last year, and that was through the generosity of David and Jean's bequest. So I'll play that clip.
The back river has beautiful riparian vegetation, lovely pools, a rare environmental system, and it's the sort of thing my dad would have loved to have created. He was hoping to do that. My father was very interested in, plant conservation. He'd spent most of his adult life growing native plant gardens. He retired to a rural property and established a large native garden. Dad joined the Bird Observers Club, for example, in the 60s and was well aware of the threats for birds. So big trees with hollows, really important. So that's one of the features here. There's lots of big trees with hollows. He was concerned about the plant conservation issues. So having big areas is important. So that's a thing about here. It's a big enough area to make a contribution. So there's lots of things about this property which were exciting. So I think when we left, we knew that this was the place. It was no surprise that Dad left a bequest for conservation property in his will. He discussed that with us, and he'd made his intentions clear years before he passed. His intention was the majority of his estate was to purchase a property for conservation, for protection of wildlife and habitat. So when it came to looking for properties, we made the decision that the Tasmanian Land Conservancy had an outstanding record. They really had very high standards for their conservation science and their land management, and they were progressive in a number of different ways which appealed to us.
We've been keen nature conservationists, I guess would be a term, for decades, and so we got a fair idea of the organisations around Australia that are doing land conservation work and managing properties. So we thought about various parts of Australia, what are possibilities, and decided that Tasmania was a very good prospect because there's some such beautiful natural areas left in Tasmania, and the animals and birds. So many more marsupials on the ground because of no foxes and so on. And we'd been supporters of Tasmanian Land Conservancy for quite a long time, about 10 years or so. We knew they were doing a great job, and so we asked them if they had any prospects, any properties that they were interested in, and of course they did. They had a whole wish list.
One of the really good features here is that this property goes from, the higher elevations right down the slopes into the waterways, and getting those lower valleys actually is important.
It's a bit of a privilege, how often do you get that opportunity to find a wonderful natural environment to preserve, protect.
I'd encourage people to get more engaged and think about the future. What is it they want to happen? How do they contribute to Australia being a wonderful place, looking after the places we love? Certainly the environment needs all the friends it can get at the moment.
And I thought I'd finish with just showing this is our current campaign, our current public campaign to protect a property on the east coast of Tasmania, just up from the Prosser River. And this is an incredible place called Kelvedon Hills, which is part of a farm, a large farm called Kelvedon Estate. The TLC has formed a relationship with those farmers over 10 years, and really proud to have the privilege now to try and establish a reserve over 1,500 hectares of that property. So if you are interested, jump on the website and have a look. This is the incredible Meredith River that cuts through the middle of the property, and a really beautiful quote from Jack and his daughter Anna, who own and manage Kelvedon Estate. And they make a beautiful Pinot if you do like a Tassie Pinot. And because it's also my job to be a glorified used car salesman, I thought I'd give one plug to a book that TLC will be publishing at the end of this month to mark our 20th year. And it's again an art and nature collaboration, and it's a collection of stories, poems and essays about Tasmania's changing relationship with nature. So if you're interested, jump on the website and have a look, and we'll hope to have it in a few bookshops in Melbourne as well. So with that, that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, James. Absolutely amazing to hear, I guess, the contribution of TLC and educating all our members on, I guess we're salivating, certainly I am, and seeing that beautiful landscape of Tasmania and looking forward to getting on a plane. I've got a couple of questions, James. One, maybe just for me, just quickly, in terms of technology and data being used in prospecting, so to speak, in the land and further programs of managing not only hectares, but also prospecting, getting new land. Do you want to just quickly explain, I guess, how your organisation does that at the moment?
Yeah, so we've developed a pretty sophisticated spatial prioritisation model, which is we call the world-class reserve system. So it basically looks at all the ecosystems that are currently in the reserve estate and what's missing, and where are the bits that are missing. So it basically gives us a score based on a whole bunch of spatial layers of every single title in Tasmania. And so it gives us a way to sort of prioritise and manage it, focus our effort. It's not always easy though. So for instance, that property I just showed you there of Jack and Anna's, we've known about that property for 15 years, but it's taken us that long to get to the point that they're willing to sell to us. So then it's about relationships. So, you know, I met Jack 10 years ago and I called him up 18 months ago and I said, hey, Jack, we're looking for a property to buy. What do you think? And he's like, oh, yeah, I'm ready to go. So it is that mix of science and data, but then also that human connection and that trust that people put into you. So we want to sort of become a purchaser of choice. We don't like operating on the free market. When you operate on the free market, you often pay more than you need to. And that ongoing relationship and connection that people have to place is a really important aspect of the organisation.
Thanks, James. I've got an interesting question from Jim Orchard talking about net zero initiative impacts to your operation, James, which you can hopefully elaborate on, and maybe talk a little bit more on the reforestation or afforestation becoming financial opportunities for your organisation in Tasmania.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's referring to our Premier's announcement today of Tasmania being net zero by 2030. We're an apolitical organisation, so I won't comment on politics. But the interesting thing about that is Tasmania 6 years ago was net positive, had zero emissions. So Tasmania's as you would know, most of Tasmania's energy comes from hydropower, and we have a pretty low carbon economy here. But there is opportunity. You know, our carbon project is a really great example of that. And that's proving that we can generate carbon credits from forestry land. So, yeah, I think there is big opportunity, and there's more opportunity on mainland Australia. Big organisations like Bush Heritage Australia and Green Australia are doing big carbon projects to sequester carbon. And, you know, we would probably get 4 or 5 calls a week from businesses and companies wanting to increase or reduce their carbon emissions by working with organisations like us. So, you know, for instance, today I met with the owners of Hobart Airport. They're looking at ways to increase their sustainability of their operations. So big opportunities, I would say.
Absolutely. Just on the terms of natural guardians, to change your mindset a little bit, James, we've had an interesting question. Do people obviously tend to bequest pieces of the land, which you just explained to us? Are you able to further discuss a little bit more about, are they able to maintain the bushland while they've been able to sell off or live on that, or while it's settling? Do you want to just maybe explain a little bit more about that process to us?
Yeah, for sure. And if people are interested, I encourage you to go to the website and click on the Gifts in Will page, and we have a detailed booklet that we've developed with some of our pro bono lawyers around gifts in will and how best to do it from a TLC perspective. But no, we always say that the gifts in wills, that there's one fellow that's donating a rare collection of coins to the organisation and other people that are donating land. I think there's an apartment in Bondi. There's all sorts of different things that have been bequeathed to the organisation. So the one thing I would say, if people are bequesting land that have natural values and they want us to keep that land in conservation, we try to engage with those people early to make sure that it hits the right standards for the organisation and we can maintain it, and we have that ongoing finance to look after it in the future. But yeah, it's super varied, people's bequests, and it can be as little as $1,000 in someone's bequest of the residue of an estate to actually the entire estate of people. So it's really diverse. But we have Sophie, who's our plan giving coordinator. She's worked in the organisation for 14 years. And we really pride ourselves on having relationships and conversations with people to make sure that we can honour their legacy, really. We don't want to get to a point where we are a beneficiary of a will and we can't honour the wishes of that will. So I'd hate to get to that point.
I think, look, we might just have time for one more question, please, Sana, before we hand over. James, you want to talk a little bit, I think, about, is from Claire, Greg was asking, have you noticed a big difference in the natural environment in Tasmania over the last 18 months due to the low tourist numbers? So no one coming to Tasmania due to obviously lockdown and COVID, etc.
It's much more enjoyable for when you live here, especially where I live in South Hobart. It's nice and quiet. It's nice going to the market again. But from an environmental perspective, I think, I don't know what it was like in Melbourne, but in Tasmania, very much people got out more and that connection. So organisations like us, last financial year and this financial year, we've had our best philanthropic results ever. Because that's sort of down to the thinking is that people have got out more, they're connected with their local environment, they're seeing the birds, they're valuing nature a bit more, they're slowing down. And then you've got a bit more of a captive audience that with communication and information, they're like, yeah, I want to contribute to that. So we're not quite seeing what other places have seen around the world where they're seeing species come back into places like that. We're very lucky to have species around Tasmania, but just going for instance, on the weekend, I was up at Cradle Mountain and it's like a ghost town compared to, Collins Street. So it is very different in terms of the visitor numbers, but I don't think it will change too much because the greatest visitor numbers in Tassie in those pinch points is very much international tourists and cruise ships and big tours out of China, whereas sort of local domestic tourism is a bit more spread out and dispersed around the landscape.
Thank you very much, James. We've had some other questions as well, so hopefully we can get them to you at a later stage, but I will now hand over back to our MC, Sana.
Thank you for that, James. As a token of our appreciation, we will be gifting you by post our limited edition R100 Centenary socks. They are 200% Australian made in Preston by our past president, Phil Endersby's organisation called Wilderness Wear. He is originally a Taswegian as well, who makes the socks in Preston, Victoria, and we'll make sure that you get those along with our traditional socks. So these socks are Tasmanian wool hiking socks, which are perfect for the outdoors while you're out there doing the great work that you do, and you'll be able to walk a lot further in these socks as well. So you'll get those in the post. I will now pass the meeting to President Reg for notices and closing.
Well, thanks so much, Sana. What a night and what an inspiration. I just have a couple of announcements. Firstly, to draw your attention to the club's environment sustainability, which has just published a new blog with highlights of projects and activities for the environment. And I invite you to take a look at that and stay up to date with what our Environment Sustainability Committee is up to. And a big thank you to Ari Talantis, who's here tonight as part of the team, who's maintaining that blog. A reminder that our next evening meeting which will continue on the second Wednesday of November, scheduled for the 10th. Our guest speaker will be David Locke, CEO and Chief Ombudsman of the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, speaking on diversity and inclusion in organisations. Please diarise the date and I hope you can join us. Next week at our regular lunchtime meeting, we have a great event planned for our annual Vocational Service Award Day. This year's recipient is Monash University's public health researcher, Professor John McNeil, AM, who has led some groundbreaking research on the efficacy of aspirin in treating older people. And now in closing, I would particularly like to say an enormous thank you to our evening meeting team, George, Udan, Claire, Stephen, Sana and Ari. Without your help, we wouldn't be able to pull off a meeting like this. I also want to say thank you, a special thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Obviously, guest speaker James, you did a great job in sharing your story, and I've just been reading carefully the accolades that have been appearing in the chat room. Fantastic and really well received, I know. I'd also like to highlight that we have 3 international visitors. Christoph from Germany, Radko from Sofia in Bulgaria, and Torsten from Switzerland. We love having you here. We hope you've enjoyed this encounter with Tasmania, which most Australians are incredibly proud of. Thank you also to Honorary Rotary Melbourne member Tillman Ruff, who has highlighted that his family has acquired 2 Tasmanian properties from TLC. Well done, Tillman, and thank you for drawing that to our attention. We now close the meeting with an element of positivity from Coldplay, with the backup from Beyonce. It's called a Hymn for the Weekend, and I hope you can enjoy it. It runs for about 3.5–4 minutes. And with that, I'll set up the share for it, and wish you a good week ahead, and please do stay safe. Now, don't rush off. Anyone who'd like to stay around and ask questions of James, he's offered to stay for a further 10 minutes. Thank you so much, James. We can open up the mics, and this will be just an open conversation. Any further questions anyone would like to raise?
I should mention too, I saw Tillman's name there, and I didn't want to drop him in case he didn't know that he owned some blocks of land in Tasmania, but I was lucky enough to survey Tillman's first block up in the northeast of the state when I was an ecologist, and it's an amazing patch of ancient old growth rainforest.
Tillman, would you like to unmute and respond?
Oh, look, it was, yeah, it's the most joyful place on the planet for me. You can just completely disappear in there. It's as, you know, as big and wonderful, magical old myrtle rainforest as you can find anywhere on the planet. And, you know, it actually didn't cost a lot of money. I mean, it's just such a good thing to do. It's, the kids go there, grandkids have been there. It's just a wonderful family resource to have, and to protect all that carbon and all that habitat is terrific. And our son is inspired by that, has bought about 200 hectares on the Tasman Peninsula, which has 3 eagles eyries on it, where he's planning to live, and which is important swift parrot habitat. So, and actually just today, Charlotte, my wife, just bought the land next door. So, so yeah,
it's a great
we're
day
heading
today.
to Tassie in a bit.
Congratulations.
So the fact that you can make such a difference, you know, that you can buy a significant piece of land from a conservation point of view and do something with it yourself, even without extraordinary means. And TLC has been absolutely terrific to work with for all of us. Couldn't commend them highly enough. So, yeah, really pleased to support you, James, and
yeah, well done
and
to all
thank
of you.
you for all the work that TLC has done, and I hope we'll, you know, we can continue to support and work together in some ways.
Brilliant, Tillman. Thanks so much for those comments. Bambi had a question. You're perfectly free to unmute and ask away, Bambi.
Hi. I had a particular question about how the Aboriginal community is being involved, if at all. I know that in central New South Wales, there was an issue for a while with non-Aboriginal people who were running the burns burning too hot, and I'm curious to see if you've been collaborating on that front to do cold burns.
Yeah, for sure. Great question. And I didn't mention much about our Aboriginal partnerships, but we've helped acquire 3 properties with the Aboriginal community, and we've actually just done one last week. We settled on a property on the East Coast. So yeah, we have really good relationships with the Aboriginal community, and the focus in Tasmania is very much around acquisition. So in Tasmania, unfortunately, the governments haven't handed much land back to Aboriginal communities or had established joint management like they have in other states. So TLC and others have sort of led the way in terms of getting freehold land back to Aboriginal communities and building their land management capabilities and also employment prospects. But we also do involve them. So when we have burning programs, mainly at our Vale of Belvoir Reserve, we work with the Aboriginal community there, and they come and participate in the burns as well, and we share that resource. So they have a fire crew, we have a fire crew, pretty small, you know, compared to parks or other agencies. But yeah, we are working together, and very much cool burns are very much aligned with ecological burns. So there's a strong synergy in those two. And another one that we're working with the community on is in the Midlands, so the Midlands Conservation Fund. A great leadership from a fellow called Julian von Bibra, who's also on our board and a generational farmer there, where there was a project there established through the University of Tasmania to do some burning trials in the grassy woodlands and grasslands of that property. And to his credit, he said, I'm only going to say yes to let you come on and do this project if the Aboriginal community do the burn. So I don't want the agencies or the parks agencies doing the burn. I want the Aboriginal community to do the burn. And, you know, that's in a very farming, very traditional conservative area. And it was quite, you know, interesting to see the Aboriginal community come in with their burning crews. And the whole community came out and they spent 3 days out there burning landscapes that, in theory, that community has never had access to since Europeans arrived. So, yeah, and hoping to continue to build on that.
Thanks, James. So much. Can I just impose, sorry, Bramble, my wife's just reminded me I need to go and consult my optometrist because I got your name terribly wrong before. I apologise for that. Any other questions?
I have a question for James. It's Lucretia Diong speaking.
Hi, Lucretia.
Hi, wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it's so fantastic to hear what you're doing, obviously, with the Aboriginal communities. My organisation works a lot with social enterprises and Aboriginal businesses, and also major infrastructure projects and commercial businesses, and which is the question I had asked earlier about what you do with regards to carbon initiatives, because we work with a lot of people who are looking for businesses like yourself to be able to support for their offset. So that was sort of one of the questions. I'd love to know more about how we can work with you, obviously, to look at pathways for that. And also, the other question is, do you work much, obviously you've mentioned about Aboriginal businesses, but other social enterprises that can support you and work with you collaboratively to create better social outcomes out of the different initiatives you're doing on the land? And the third question, do you undergo any remediation of the properties that have been affected by pollution and so forth, to bring them back, you know, to what they were previously through industrial issues or whatever it may be?
Awesome, thank you. You have to remind me if I miss any of your questions. I'll go with the remediation one first. We're very lucky in Tassie that we still have intact ecosystems. So I'll still never forget the first time I came to Tassie from Victoria, and I was working on the surf coast, and most of my work was around restoration and weeding and planting and erosion control. And I went to a property in the northwest, and I also started my career in the Otways, in the Otway National Park. And that private property was in 1,000 times better condition than the national park in Victoria. So, you know, it shows you in Tassie, we're very lucky that on private land, there's still these vast areas that have been relatively untouched. And they might have been logged when Europeans first came, but by hand, not with big machines and things like that. So we're very lucky that there's still, we talk about resilience in the landscape. There's still a lot of resilience and regeneration, natural regeneration. So that's what we're looking for when we're buying properties, is where we're going to get a best return on investment and where do we focus on protecting what's intact first before we have to do any restoration work. So we do a little bit, but actually where there's still vast areas that, you know, just can be purchased and protected and then managed adequately. In terms of second question was around enterprises, social enterprises and business. So we had a tourism operation on our Scarborough Plains Reserve. This is not to do with social benefits, but it's just a commercial business operating on that property. It was a fly fishing, high-end fly fishing venture where people will come from all over the world when they could to spend time in the highlands of Tasmania fishing for trout. I did it once. I'm not a fly fisher. I got so incredibly bored, I just left my rod and just went for a walk instead. I have no idea how people have patience to go fly fishing for days on end, but you know, all power to them. They're spending time in nature, and that's a positive thing. So we have had some projects like that. I would say that the strongest thing that we have around social causes and enterprises is actually seeing this growth in businesses donating profits or percentages of their profits to the TLC. So there's a thing called 1% for the Planet that Patagonia, the clothing company, sort of started. And we're seeing that grow all over the place. So lots of tourism operators in Tasmania are now part of that. And through their employment streams, whether they're training young kids or disadvantaged kids in tourism operations, and they're actually contributing money to TLC as part of their enterprise and their business. And we're seeing huge growth of that. Another one, commercial venture through that was Paddy Pellin, which is an outdoor brand. They had this project called Don't Bag the Environment, which was if you didn't take a bag when you purchased something, they made a contribution to an environmental charity. TLC was that charity last year, and we got $25,000 from that initiative. So you're starting to see actually companies wanting to contribute to causes that align to their values and their customer base. So yeah, it's really interesting. From a social venture perspective, we do support Pakana Services, which is a local Aboriginal land regeneration, land management crew. They employ young Indigenous kids and train them up in land management, and we employ them as contractors on our reserve. So we do try to support enterprise in different ways, but we also try to support jobs in the regions where we're working. And the first question was about carbon credits, and it is really challenging for small businesses. All those businesses that are often contributing want to contribute carbon offsets. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. And so, for instance, we trade with Virgin, and for instance, we're trading 13,000 ACCUs, which are Australian carbon credit units, and that's at a value of about $250,000. So most people can't afford that, obviously, and that's for aviation. But in a small sense, for instance, someone might want to offset a holiday or a part of their business, and it might be that they only need to offset 6,000 tonnes of carbon, and 6,000 tonnes is the equivalent of 6 ACCUs, so they need to offset that. We don't sell small amounts of carbon like that, but there are companies, one that we're currently working with, which is based out of New Zealand, and I would encourage anyone in Australia to try and set one up really quickly because there's a huge market for it. It's called Carbon Click, and it's basically a simple way that anyone, an individual or a business, can go on and say, I want to offset this much carbon, and you can pick a project that you offset from, and they become like an intermediary between like a wholesaler like TLC, and then they provide the retail benefit for a small business or an individual. So yeah, did I get all three?
You did. No, that's fantastic. And I was actually talking about the larger corporates who, you know, have millions to spend rather than the smaller. And I think that there is a big market for that. There's a lot of pressure now within the industry to support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's never been more aware than it is now. So I think you're absolutely in the right place at the right time. And I'm guessing you've got donation gift status.
Yes, we do. We are DGR registered, so all donations are tax deductible. And I should have said the other thing that the organisation did with the bequest program too. So the bequest that we got from the McGregors, TLC's never operationalised our bequests. So when we get a bequest, it doesn't fund for office rent or salaries or anything. It's actually extra money, which we don't budget for. So that's how we've grown our foundation to $18 million, is that we put bequest income in there, or we're able to go out and buy a property like the Prosser River Reserve. So it actually increases from a business perspective. It's not a revenue base that we actually budget for.
James, thank you. I think we've got time for one more, and I think Cynthia Edgell might have wanted to ask a question. Are you ready with yours, Cynthia?
Yes. James, it was wonderful. I was brought up in Tasmania in land that was so like the Kingston place that the Camerons had. I could almost expect to turn around and there's a familiar paddock. But it was a family farm and a living had to be made. And when I go back there now, so much has been cleared for cropping, poppies and other types of crops with huge pivots and circles and vegetation just cleared for acres and huge areas. And I'm just wondering how that whole issue of how the land's treated and how you deal with the farmers who need to make a living, I guess.
Yeah, it's always that battle with conservation and agriculture. And the amazing thing with the Midlands Conservation Fund, it's so successful. Like I worked all over northeast Victoria and western Victoria with farmers, and they're a great group, great bunch, but very different to farmers in Tasmania, especially the Midlands of Tasmania. And interestingly, the reason the MCF went hard, so we actually overcapitalised and we've signed up more area than we can afford through our foundation, because we were seeing loss. So we were literally losing 1% a year, and there was less than 10% of that entire ecosystem left. So 10 years it would be all gone. And in my 10 years of being in Tasmania, I've seen huge areas of native grasslands up the Midlands now converted to poppies, and they're just gone. And there was a story just before I moved to Tassie, which is just perverse around government policy. They federally listed the grassland communities in the Midlands of Tasmania, and the farmers got wind of it, a number of farmers, and the story was that the tractors were going 24 hours a day at 3 a.m. ploughing up the native grasslands, and they lost about 4% of the extent of those grasslands in 3 or 4 days, because farmers saw it as a huge risk to their livelihoods, that these areas were going to be locked up and they couldn't farm them. But again, then that difference with the Midlands Conservation Fund is we actually need the sheep to maintain those grasslands in a particular way. So it's actually becomes part of the business transaction. So when the farmer's sitting down looking at the way they move sheep around, our ecologist is sitting there with them and saying, well, that paddock needs to be hit, for this length of time, and the kangaroo grass is starting to go a bit rank and we need to hit it there. So it's actually inserting the ecologist into sort of that commercial decision making, but in a really trusting way. And that takes time. And it's taken TLC and Bush Heritage probably 15 years to get to that point. But previously with government programs, there's the fear. It's not built on trust. It's like, what's going to happen? I'm not going to be able to do what I'm meant to do. So yeah, in Tasmania, we are seeing, Simon is a classic, but you're starting to see now these entrepreneurial farmers that are using the Tasmanian brand to market their product. So Country Road have done it. Autovox, which is a company or an outdoor company from Germany, and they buy a lot of their merino wool from Tasmania. So there's actually now, those guys are actually going to get a benefit because they've actually maintained the ecology or the natural areas on their system. So it's always a tension. And one thing that we would love to see is to actually see farmers being rewarded for their stewardship and their ecological contribution. And we have done a number of projects trying to get that off the ground, sort of like a biodiversity credit instead of a carbon credit. So the thing about the Midlands project was, at the time, it was sort of seen as putting conservation on the balance sheet. And in essence, if the farmer doesn't see conservation on the balance sheet, it sort of becomes deprioritised. So it's a really important aspect. But the one thing I would say about Tasmania, as an ecologist going out and meeting lots of farmers, they would all say, I'm no greenie, but I love my property. And so I never, almost every property I went to, because the divisiveness of politics in Tasmania, green or not, but the amount of people that were like, I'm no greenie, but I love my paddock, or I love that there's bettongs living in the back paddock, or I love the wedge-tailed eagle in the gully. So how you use that as the connector and then connect that to some sort of action or behavioural change. And I think that's the success of what TLC has been able to do over 20 years.
Oh, well done. That's wonderful.
Marvellous. Tillman, you had one final comment, which I might invite you to tell the meeting. Are you okay with that?
Oh yeah, look, I'm not a farmer, but I have some dear friends who are, and Eve Cantor and Mark Wooden have done absolutely sterling leading work on their large property in Western Victoria, about 15,000 acres now of sort of fine wool sheep. They've revegetated 30% of it. They've got over 100 new bird species that they had lost that are back, and they're actually doing better in terms of their lamb survival, soil, water content, in every respect. It's a carbon neutral farm, and the revegetation has made economic sense for them from the point of view of sheep. So I just cite it as a one sizable example that there are smart ways of doing things that are win-win rather than win-lose. Thanks.
It's an interesting thing too with the Calverton Hills property that we're buying. So that's a 5,000 hectare merino property, and they've diversified now into Pinot. So Jack and Anna make more money from 8 hectares of Pinot than 5,000 hectares of sheep country. So that's why they're actually selling to TLC. It makes economic sense, but it's also a good fit that we're going to be a good neighbour and we're going to look after it. And there's probably a commercial benefit in them from marketing their wine. But there is that shift that hopefully in Tasmania we can get quickly. As Tillman said, instead of putting 30% back, we can protect 30% that's still here. So, and all those previous farmers, a lot of them were told by their parents and their parents' parents that the native run country was their insurance policy. So when drought hit, they put all their sheep up in the native run country and the tussock country because it would give them cover and food. And then all the other farmers are having to sell off sheep. They could buy their sheep cheap and then sell them back to them when it rained. And it actually made economic sense to actually keep some of those native countries under a sort of much more sheep grazing approach. But very much, as Cynthia said, the rise of irrigation and cropping in Tasmania smashes that out of the water. You're looking at, yields of, I think it's something like, $30,000 a hectare profits, as opposed to sheep, which require much greater areas.
The wool prices do go up, and they have.
George, I think I've stolen the thunder of the evening team by
not at all. I think it's
imposing
been
the
great. Not at all, Reg. I think it's been great listening to all the conversations and the questions, and so grateful that James has been able to stay on and answer them. So thank you very much.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, James. Great offer, and very much appreciated by those who've stayed back. So I think we might all go and have some dinner, huh? Thanks everyone for being here again. It's been a great meeting. Absolute inspiration.
Thanks very much, James. Look forward to catching up at some stage down south.
For sure. Thanks everyone. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Good night.
Bye.